So I'll be talking to you today about Airtable data in Eleventy. My name is Cassey Lottman. I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska in the US, which is, as you might not know, a mere 6-hour drive from Carhenge, the happiest place on earth that is in Nebraska. Carhenge is pictured here as this big circle of cars in the form of a henge. I work as a junior partner at Unabridged Software, where I do full stack development. We do a lot of Ruby on Rails, but I also get to work in Eleventy for some of our client sites, and my personal site is in Eleventy. You can find me on Twitter at these handy links or on. So first, we're going to talk about what is an Airtable, why are we doing any of this? So I got the idea to, or had a reason to use Airtable for my site because I want to build a now page. And I know a few of you on this call might have a now page already, Corey being one of them, I think, that I took inspiration from. The now page loosely movement is talking about how, like, okay, if you're a company, you might have an about page, but if you're a person, you might have an about page, but what if we had a now page? And the idea is kind of, what are you going to tell a friend that you haven't seen in a long time that you're up to if you're going to talk about what's going on in your life? But how I've seen a lot of people who like hacking on their sites do it is they want to put things that they're currently doing in their day-to-day life. So what are you reading? What are you listening to or watching? And there's a lot of different ways that people track what they're consuming as far as media. And the only one really that I use that has a nice API, though I think Spotify has an API, a lot of the people making now pages are using Last.fm somehow, or for some reason, that's just like really popular in the subset of people who want to add this to their site. And Last.fm apparently has an API. But I use Airtable to track my reading. And Airtable is like a relational database crossed with a spreadsheet. So if you're used to using Google Sheets or Excel, it's going to feel really familiar. But if you know just a little bit about what relational databases can do, it's going to get really powerful. So this is my Airtable library where I track my books. You can do lots of fancy grouping. It has a really nice UI, including on mobile. If you've tried using spreadsheet software on mobile, it's generally a terrible experience, and it's pretty okay on Airtable's app. You can do grouping. So I'm grouping my books here by the year I finished reading it. I have a secondary grouping of when I started, which is a field that I don't always use. So all of these are empty for the started field. And then I can put as much data in here as I want. I can sort. There's different views that you can do. You can have a Kanban view with columns for if you're using it to create like your to-do list or something. And you can add relations where I'm not really using in this base is what Airtable calls a table very much, but the relations might be that if I want to have like a CRM, a relationship tracker, I might make a profile for each of my friends that I want to talk to, and you can link to the profile that's in a different table, and it's just really nice. So these years are a multi-select instead of just regular text, and that helps keep my data nice and clean for when I'm tracking things. So our goals for this project are we're going to fetch some data from Airtable. I'm storing my books in there. I want my books on my website, and I want to have that be up to date. So anytime I start reading a new book, I want that to update on my site in some short amount of time that I started a new book. And if I finish a book, I want it to get off of my currently reading list. I want to cache that data because sometimes the Airtable API might not be available, but I still want my site to work if I'm building my site then. Or I might be working on some other feature of my site and doing build after build after build. And I don't want to hammer the Airtable API because I want to be nice to them and I don't want them to turn off my access or start rate limiting me. I want to play nicely with companies that give me a nice API for my data. And finally, I want to display the data. I want it to be on my site. Right now, it's just on an about page because I was having some hesitations about where the now page fit in my navigation bar. So it's just on the about page, but conceptually, it's a now page. And a goal that is not going to be part of this talk is we want to build our site on a regular basis so that we can get that fresh data every day or at some frequency. There's a lot of great talks on that. A GitHub action is a solution that people work with most of the time. If your code's on GitHub and you're using a host like Netlify, you can have a GitHub action to trigger a build. That's what I did. I put it off for a long time because I read all these people talking about how they set up a GitHub action to work with Netlify. And the times I've worked with CI at work, it's always been kind of a pain. And I didn't want to do it. And then I did it and it took like 5 minutes. So don't be afraid if you want to do this, but you're not sure about the part where you hook it up to have daily builds. It's really not that bad. And if you're struggling, just like Dante said, there's always people in the Eleventy Discord who will be happy to help you. So let's get to the code. We're going to need to install some packages. So we'll need the Airtable.js library. They have a really pretty nice package that you can use to query your Airtable data instead of like handcrafting a lot of really complicated fetch requests. We're going to need Eleventy Fetch. That's going to provide our caching layer, which is an official Eleventy plugin. And as we are reading on the Eleventy Fetch documentation, we see the big warning that says you should add the .cache folder to your gitignore. So we're definitely going to do that too, because as the docs say, even if Airtable isn't leaking our credentials into the API response right now, we don't know what else we're going to do with Eleventy Fetch later on, and we want to make sure that we're not leaking our credentials into our cache folder, which could end up in our GitHub repository if it's not in our gitignore. We don't want to do that. We want to keep our data nice and safe, so we're putting that cache folder in our gitignore. We're going to need a personal access token from Airtable. The Airtable docs, which we'll talk about in just a minute, will have pretty straightforward instructions on how to get a personal access token to access your Airtable account as a developer and from tools like the Airtable API. And if you're not already using the .env npm package, you'll want to add that too, so that we can access our personal access token from an env file. And we'll need an Airtable base to pull from, and that also involves getting an Airtable account if you don't already use Airtable. There's a free tier that is sufficient for my needs. There's a lot of fancy stuff you can get if you pay for Airtable, but to just do what I'm doing, everything I'm doing is on the free tier of Airtable, and we'll set up some fields and some data that we'll be playing with. So when you go to the Airtable API, and you look at the Airtable API reference, you're going to see this page, and it's pretty normal stuff. But you're going to scroll down because what we want is the interactive Airtable things. And it's going to say the name of your workspace here. So probably your name instead of my name is going to be right here on this API reference if you're logged into Airtable. And then you're going to pick the name of the base that you're working with. So for me, it's going to be my library. And you'll click that, and then it's going to take you to this other documentation section, which is way better and a lot more clear. If you're just over here, it's going to tell you like the strict REST API or REST API for Airtable that you're going to create your own fetches with. But if you're using Airtable.js library that we're using, we're going to want these cool interactive things that shows you the code right over here. If you see the fetch requests or the curl requests, be sure to click this button right here that says JavaScript. So you get the JavaScript version, lots of code to copy and paste. It will show you your exact data and the structure of your base within this code. So here, if you had a view that was called something different than my library, it would show your view name right here. And there's also the authentication section here is going to tell you using the Airtable JavaScript library how to get your personal access token. Okay, so all the code that we're using to get the data is going to be in our data directory. We're going to make it global data so that we can access it from anywhere in our site. That goes in our underscore data folder, or if you have a custom data directory, put it wherever your custom data directory is. And then always remember, the way you access this later is going to be the name of the file minus the extension is the key to access whatever data you're storing there or returning from it. So in our reading list.js file, which is my global data, including the Airtable library, I'm connecting to my base, and here's where I know that I've installed the .env package and I've instantiated it in my Eleventy config. So my process.env.airtable API key is available to me. You don't need to store your base ID in your process.env. That is technically like not super secret information, but it just makes me more comfortable to have it private in case later on I mess with my view settings and leave something open that I didn't mean to be. So I have it in my env as well. In here where you're calling your base, you can also use the name of your base. So instead of using the base ID, I could just put in my library as a string and that would work. But then if you rename your table, like I did a couple days before this talk, I would have to go change my code for it to keep working, whereas the base ID is going to be stable. And a note on terminology. Airtable, in most of their documentation that's not geared towards developers, like not the API documentation, refers to it as bases for a table. But the Airtable docs actually do call their bases tables. So just note, those are the same thing when you're looking at the Airtable docs. Okay, so now we're going to fetch some data. And for the purposes of this slide, I took out everything related to caching. So this is just fetching. And you'll see it looks a lot like the slide that we saw a little before that we took from Airtable, but a few things are different. On the documentation, they're using a callback flow to do their asynchronous code. So this function page gets called for each set of records, and fetch next page gets called to see if there's more records to return. Airtable's API is going to limit you to 100 records at a time. So if we have 150 books, we're going to need 2 pages, 2 different calls to the API to get all of our data. You could totally ignore this fetch next page stuff if you know your table's never going to exceed 100 records, but it's probably a best practice to just follow the paging flow as best you can, just in case your table grows for some reason, and you keep it a little more future-proof. And then after there's no more pages, the API library is going to call done for you, and it'll do something with your data. So we want an asynchronous data file. So we're going to call await at the top, and we want each page to resolve and give us the response at the end. So we're not using that done function. We're kind of switching to an async await style. And if you need some help with that, there's a lot of good blog posts online, or come to the Eleventy Discord and we can help you out. Because switching from the callback style of asynchronous code to the async await can be a little confusing. Took a little bit of experimentation for me to get it right. I'm using a filter by formula here. You can set one of your columns in Airtable to be a formula column. And here I'm doing an or. So I've either read the book or it's in progress. Those are the books that I want to read. And I recommend like testing those formulas in Airtable before you try to put it in your code. Because in Airtable, you'll see it just update automatically as you change your formula. Whereas here, it's a lot harder to parse if it's doing the right thing, getting the right results for the formula. So that formula is going to end up being a column in your table. So I'm going to have a 0 or a 1 for this red column, or a 0 for a 1 for this in progress column. And it's going to union those together to get the books that I want to read. And this is necessary because I also store books that I haven't started yet or just want to read in my book list. So we're going to go each page, and for each page we call this function page, which gives us some records, and a fetch next page function. We're going to store some data about this. So we're building up this books array that we, or object that we instantiated in the code in my last slide. We want to handle books that I've read a little differently than books that I'm currently reading. So that's what this special case is here. And we want to spit out if there's any errors. And then we're going to fetch the next page. And when all the pages are done, each page is going to resolve, and we're going to return books. And if you want to follow along with the blog post I wrote for this, check out my link down here. And I'll have a link to this later too, to get the blog post version. So what do we need to do to cache this data? We've got our caching, or our Airtable fetching, and that is all hidden by this get our data function here on line 15. So everything from the previous slide, if you can kind of interpolate it in your head, goes into get our data. The main thing here that we're looking at is this is code from the Eleventy Fetch plugin, which is a NPM package. It looks like I cut out my require at the top, but we'd have require at Eleventy/Eleventy Fetch at the top or something like that. And asset cache is what we're going to use from the Eleventy Fetch plugin. You can use any key for that as long as it's unique among the other code in your app. So you don't want two data files that are both writing to Airtable books read. That would be bad. But you can have any key name for the asset cache constructor. This is a little different than the standard way that you've probably seen the Eleventy Fetch used. Eleventy Fetch's default way of operating is it takes a single URL, it calls that URL, and it returns the data and caches whatever came back from the URL exactly as it came back. It doesn't do any of that processing stuff that we saw on the previous slide, where we're creating a book record object to push into our array. It just says, here's the big blob of JSON that you got back from that URL. And the reason we're not doing that is because of that paging functionality, that Airtable is only going to give us 100 of the records for each page. And we need to do a bunch of queries, and we don't know exactly how many. So it'd be hard to give it just one URL to cache. The asset cache method that we're using is explicitly supported by the Eleventy Fetch plugin. But if you go on the docs, there's a big warning that says this probably isn't what you want to do. Unless you have a really good reason, you should use the other one. That paging functionality and how we're transforming the data before we store it is our really good reason and why we're using the asset cache. So here is if the cache is valid, we're just going to return the cached value. So that's the data we already had that we stored in our asset cache. And then every time we get our data, we're going to call asset.save with the data that we have that's in our books array or object, and with the format that it's in. It's a JSON format. We're returning the books. And if there happens to be an error from get our data, then we're going to return the cached value. So if this happens on the very first time we run it, it's going to return nothing because there's not going to be any cache value. But if it happens on the second time, and the Airtable API worked the first time, didn't work the second time, we'll have some cached data and our build will still succeed, which may or may not be what you want, but that's up to you. And finally, we're going to display some data. So this is in Nunjuck syntax. It's pretty standard code for displaying your data in Nunjucks. So my global data is available as a reading list. There's a key called current that I have an array stored in of the current books I'm reading. I'm using the length filter in Nunjucks to determine if there's anything in that reading list.current. And then for each book, I iterate over the book name, which I know is definitely present just because of how I record my books. But sometimes I have the author name and sometimes I don't, if I just put a book in on the fly and don't remember the author name. So I'm checking if I've got the author name, and if I do, I show it. And if I'm not reading anything, I display a little error message well, not really an error. I'm not reading anything message. And so there I'm using the length filter again with not. So yeah, that's all I've got. The last step of this would be setting up that GitHub action to build my site every day. So I keep updating this page of data from Airtable, but you can find that elsewhere. I'm not going to cover it again. That's all I've got. And if there's any questions, I will be happy to address them.